Chapter 7 of Mrs. Pigwiggle, the Slow Eater Tiny Bite Taker Cure. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named Alan. He had curly brown hair and sturdy legs and a very shiny smile. One morning he sat down to breakfast, but instead of picking up his spoon and eating his mush and milk like a good little boy, he took a fork and began eating his cereal grain by grain. When his mother, certain that he had eaten all of his mush, brought him his egg, he was still on the 11th grain of cereal. Alan's mother said, "My goodness, you are poky this morning. What is the matter? Is the mush too hot?" Then she noticed that Alan was eating his cereal with a fork, and so she took the fork away and handed him a spoon, saying, "Now then, eat properly and hurry up or your egg will get cold." Alan took the spoon, but instead of filling it with the mush, he daintily lifted one grain from the bowl and slowly brought it up to his mouth. His mother watched him for a few minutes, and then she said, "Well, eat an ice-cold egg if you like, but I am going upstairs to sort the laundry, and when I come down, I want to find every bit of that mush on egg all eaten." Alan's mother went skipping upstairs and left Alan in the breakfast nook. As soon as his mother left the kitchen, Alan picked up the fork again and began eating his mush by the grain. In a little while, even a whole grain seemed too much, so he broke each grain into two, taking only half the grain on his fork at a time. He was so interested in this little bitty bites that he didn't hear his mother come in, and was very surprised when she suddenly whisked away his breakfast and sent him marching up to his room. At lunchtime, Alan's mother made cream of tomato soup. This was Alan's very favorite soup, but Alan, instead of eating it up quickly and asking for more, began floating little specks of cracker in the bowl. He floated, chased, and ate them one by one. At 2 o'clock, his mother stopped the little cracker crumb chase, sadly cleaned up the table, and sent Alan up for a nap. At dinner that night, Alan cut his meat into such small pieces that his father looked over him and said, "Perhaps you would like to borrow my magnifying glass. I'm sure you are going to need it to see those infinitesimal bites of meat." Alan's mother said, "He has been like that all day, eating his mush grain by grain with a fork, floating tiny cracker crumbs in his soup and chasing and eating them one by one, and now this meat. What's the matter with you, Alan?" Alan smiled his shiny smile and said, "I guess I'm just a slow eater. I choke if I take larger bites." And his mother said, "Nonsense, you were all right yesterday." Alan said sadly, "Yes, Mother, but that was yesterday." And he carefully cut the grain of corn into 4 pieces and delicately put the smallest piece into his mouth. The next morning he had not improved a bit, and although his mother scolded and scolded, he took the smallest, slowest bites imaginable, and to make matters worse, he sighed and gazed around the room between each bite. Alan's mother was very distressed, and not knowing what else to do, she called her friend, Mrs. Crankminer. "Good morning, Mrs. Crankminer," said Alan's mother. "This is Alan's mother, and I called to ask if you have ever had any difficulty with, well, these names, Weatherill about eating." "Difficulty?" said Mrs. Crankminer. "Just what kind of eating difficulty?" "Well," said Alan's mother, "Alan has suddenly taken to eating so slowly that if I didn't take his plate away, I'm sure that it would take him approximately 12 hours to eat an average meal. He eats his cereal grain by grain and his soup drop by drop and his meat pour by pour." "Goodness gracious, is the child ill?" asked Mrs. Crankminer. "No, he says he feels well, and I have taken his temperature and it's normal. I don't know what the trouble is," said Alan's poor worried mother. And Mrs. Crankminer said, "I certainly have no complaint about Wetherill's eating. My only difficulty is in getting him to stop. Yesterday morning before breakfast he wedgied in 182 pounds. He registered in at 182 pounds, and his father has begun calling him Blimpy." "Oh my," said Alan's mother. "I guess you have a more serious problem than I have," and she hung up the phone. Then she called her friend Mrs. Wingsthrupple. "Mrs. Wingsthrupple," she said, "do you have any trouble with Pegoria at mealtimes?" And Mrs. Wingsgrapple said, enunciating very carefully, "No, not exactly trouble, but we do have to keep her after to chew each mouthful 100 times. Sometimes she is forgetful and only chews her food about 90 times. One day I caught her stopping at 71. Alan's mother could already picture how disastrous it might be if Alan heard that Pagoria Wingsproggle chewed each bite 100 times, because if she multiplied each grain of mush in a dish by 100 and took the count to unbelievable slowness with which Alan was able to chew, she realized that he would die of slow starvation before the day had passed. Alan's mother hurriedly said goodbye to Mrs. Wingsproggle and hung up the phone. Then she called Patsy's mother and said, "Does Patsy eat everything that's put before her quickly and without urging?" And Patsy's mother said, Why, yes, she does. Why?" Alan's mother said, "Because Alan has taken into eating like a scared mosquito, and I don't know what to do." Patsy's mother said, "Call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. She'll know what to do. You remember the radish cure, don't you?" Alan's mother was delighted. Of course, I'll do it. I'll call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle right now." And she did. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "So Alan has become a slow eater, tiny bite taker, has he? I thought he looked a little pale this afternoon." Alan's mother said, "He is so pale his father calls him his little doughboy, and I know that he hasn't eaten more than a tablespoon of food in the last 2 days. What will I do, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" And Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Don't worry about Alan. He'll be all right again in a day or two. Let me see. Yes, it is Alan coming down the street right now. So I'll send him home with the slow eater, tiny bite taker dishes with him. Use the largest set for Alan's dinner tonight, the medium size for his meals tomorrow, and the small size the next day, and the very small dishes the next day. Serve him portions of food to fit the dishes." So they're going to start off big and they're going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. That will be 4 days in all, counting today. And though he may lose some weight, he will gain it right back. I may send for him on the last day. No matter how he feels, let him come to my house." Alan's mother said, "Thank you very much. Thank you. And Mrs. Piggle, I will do just as you say, and I will be so happy when he's cured." "I will send Alan right home with the dishes," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "Now don't worry, simply follow my instructions," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, and she said goodbye. After a little while, Alan came home carrying a large wicker basket. "Here's a present for Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, Mother. She said for me to be very careful with it." He set the basket on the kitchen floor and commanded to undo the fastenings, and his mother said, "No, dear, this is a present for me, and I think I'll just put it aside for now. You run out and play until dinner. Goodness, you are pale. Run as fast as you can down to Patsy's house and put some roses into your cheeks. Get some color." Alan's mother put the basket on the top shelf in the kitchen and shut the cupboard door, which left nothing for Alan to do but to go out and play. However, instead of running down to Patsy's, he walked very, very slowly because he was tired from not having had enough to eat. Just before dinner time, Alan's mother took down the basket and opened it. There were 4 little sets of dishes. The larger set had a plate the size of a saucer, so the kind you put a cup under, a cup-like small after-dinner coffee cup, and a small fork and a little spoon. The medium-sized set had a plate like a doll plate, a doll cup, and a very small fork and spoon. The small size had the plate the size of a silver dollar, and a cup like a thimble, and a fork like a match, and a spoon like a salt spoon. The tiny size set had a plate the size of a penny, the cup that would hold but a drop, and a fork like a needle, and a spoon like a pin. Alan's dinner that night was served in a large set. He was given a baked potato as small as an egg, and a piece of meat like a postage stamp, a slice of tomato, and a small cup of milk. Alan was so interested in taking tiny bites that he didn't even notice his new dishes. He ate 1/3 of the potato, 1/6 of the meat, and 1 tomato seed, and drank about half a cup of milk. When he asked to be excused, his father looked at his saucer plate, still heaped with food, and started to say no, but Alan's mother quickly said, "Yes, dear, you may be excused, but you must play in your room until bedtime." The next morning, his mother put out a teaspoon of scrambled egg and an inch-square piece of toast on a medium-sized plate, and a tablespoon of orange juice in the doll cup. Alan loved the tiny fork and spoon because he was able to take such small bites that in 1 hour he had eaten half of the egg and 1/3 of the toast. He did drink all of the orange juice. At lunchtime and dinner time, he ate even less and took even smaller bites. He had turned very pale, a very pale shade of green, and was so tired he had to sit down all the time. The next day, his mother brought out the small dishes. On the dollar plate, she put 3 cornflakes, a piece of bacon the size of a snowflake, and a quarter of a teaspoon of egg. In the thimble cup, she had put 10 drops of cocoa. Alan was so tired that he had to crawl to the breakfast table on his hands and knees. He was happy about the tiny dishes, though, and he gave his mother a very sickly edition of a shiny smile. He cut the cornflake into 13 pieces and ate a part of one. He ate a speck of egg, a nimble of bacon, and 5 drops of cocoa, and then he crawled in and lay on the couch. For lunch, he had 7 drops of soup, 2 cracker crumbs, and enough milk to barely moisten his lips. For dinner, he ate 1 lima bean, drank 4 drops of milk, and he crawled to bed right after dinner. He had to rest 8 times on the way up the stairs. And there's a picture of him. It looks like coming to the table. The next morning, he was so tired it took him almost half an hour to crawl down to breakfast. His mother had the penny plate, the drop cup, and the needle, fork, and pin spoon. On the penny plate, she had 1 grain of egg, 2 toast crumbs, 2 raspberry jam seeds, and had a drop of milk in the cup. Alan was so weak that he had to lift the needle fork with both hands, but even so, when he cut one of the grains of egg into 2 and ate only 1 of the toast crumbs, he drank half a drop of milk, and then he lay down on the breakfast nook beneath. Just then the telephone rang, and it was Mrs. Pigglewiggle for Alan. His mother had to carry him to the telephone and hold the big, heavy telephone receiver. Mrs. Pigglewiggle had a great difficulty in hearing his weak, squeaky voice, and finally had to give up and talk to his mother. Mrs. Pigglewiggle said, "It is Alan's turn to exercise the spotted pony, and I would like him to come over here right away." Alan's mother told Alan, and he was very excited, but he was so weak that his mother had to carry him out and put him in his little red wagon. Fortunately, it was downhill all the way to Mrs. Pigglewiggle's house, and when he got there, Dick Thompson and Herbert Prentice were waiting for him out in front. They lifted him out of his little red wagon and laid him across the Spotty's back. Spotty turned his head around and licked the top of Alan's head comfortably. Mrs. Pigglewiggle came out of her front porch to see him off, and it took much self-control for her to keep from laughing at Spotty. Started slowly off down the street with Alan lying on his back like a bag of cornmeal. All morning, Alan lay on Spotty's back, his face buried in his mane, while Spotty paced around the streets. Several times, women rushed out of their houses and asked Alan if he was ill or if he needed help. Alan was very embarrassed and squeaked out, "I'm all right," and he tried to sit up, but he was too weak. When 12 o'clock came, Alan was so tired that he knew that he could not stay on Spotty's back another minute, so he guided the pony up to his own front gate. Then he rolled off his back and into the grass, and he lay there like a wet sock, crying. His mother looked out the kitchen window, and seeing him lying there, she became frightened. She thought Spotty was a spirited horse and that he had bucked Alan off, but she ran out and knelt beside him. "Darling, are you hurt? Did that vicious horse throw you? How many times did he buck?" Alan smiled weakly at the idea of gentle little Spotty bucking or throwing anyone, and then he began to cry again, and he remembered that this was his last chance for a long time to exercise Spotty, and he was so weak that he couldn't stay on his back, and he finally said to his mother, "Spotty did not buck or throw me. It's just that I am so tired I cannot stay on his back. I rolled off and now I can't get back on, and it's my turn to exercise him, and I won't have another turn for a long time." Alan's mother said, "Now see here, Alan, this all comes from your turning into a slow eater, tiny bite taker. And if you want to ride Spotty this afternoon, you will have to come into the house and eat something." She tied Spotty to the fence, picked up Alan, and carried him into the house, and set him in the breakfast nook. He leaned weakly back against the wall and closed his eyes. His mother began rattling pans and turning on burners, and pretty soon she handed him a drop cup filled with cream of tomato and the penny plate with 2 cracker crumbs on it. And she said, "Now, drink this soup in one gulp and put both of those crumbs in your mouth at once." Alan did as he was told, and then he leaned back and closed his eyes again. And then his mother handed him a thimble cup filled with milk and a tiny peanut butter sandwich on the dollar plate and said, "Drink this milk in one swallow and put that whole sandwich in your mouth." Alan did as he was surprised to find that he didn't feel quite so tired. And he leaned back, but he kept his eyes open. Then his mother handed him the doll-sized cup filled with soup and the doll plate with some cottage cheese on it. "Drink that soup right down," she said. "And here is a large fork, and I want that cottage cheese eaten in 2 bites." Alan did as he was told. But he was feeling strong. He could sit up without leaning back, and oddly enough, he was very hungry. His mother handed him the after-dinner coffee cup filled with milk and the saucer plate with a piece of gingerbread on it. Alan didn't have to be told how to eat and drink these. He took large, hungry bites and big swinging gulps, and the dishes were empty. And his mother said, "Do you feel better, dear? Have you had enough lunch?" And Alan said, "I feel much better, Mother, but I'm still very hungry. May I please have a large bowl of soup and a large glass of milk?" "Of course, dear," said his mother, and she quickly filled the large bowl with soup and a large glass with milk. And Alan ate every drop of soup and drank every drop of milk, and then jumped up from the table saying, "Oh, Mother, I bet Spotty's hungry. Shall I take him some soup?" "No, dear," said his mother. "I think that Spotty would prefer an apple and some lumps of sugar." So they fed Spotty, and then Alan climbed on his back and rode proudly away, sitting up very straight and holding onto the reins with one hand. When he reached the corner by Patsy's house, his mother called him to come back. He turned Spotty around and steered him up to the gate, and his mother came out with a basket of the slow eater, tiny bite taker dishes. "Would you mind returning these to Mrs. Pigglewiggle?" she asked. "Not at all," said Alan graciously. "Just hand me the basket. I'll put it here in front of me and hold this with one hand. You see, Mother, I only use one hand to steer now." He carefully arranged the basket, kissed his mother, clucked to Spotty, and away they went in a very slow walk toward Mrs. Pigglewiggle's house. That's the end of chapter 7. Next will be chapter 8, The Fight Quarreler's Cure.